The world is changing. Inspiration is everywhere. It has never been so easy to connect, share, and bring people together. We're learning from others and finding the best in ourselves. Challenging our beliefs. Sharing our vulnerability. Overcoming our fears. Transforming ourselves so we can transform the world. How far can we go?
This is London Real. I am Brian Rose. My guest today is... This is London Real. I am Brian Rose. My guest today is Dr. Aseem Malhotra, the award-winning cardiologist, public health campaigner, and author. You are considered one of the world's foremost experts on heart disease, obesity, and population health, and were named in the Sunday Times list of the most influential people in science and medicine in the UK. You've written 3 books, including the best-selling 21-Day Immunity Plan, The Piapi Diet, and A Statin-Free Life. And you've been a prominent advocate against the use of COVID vaccines and believe the mRNA product is the likely contributory factor in all unexpected cardiac arrests, heart attacks, strokes, arrhythmia, and heart failure since 2021. Ultimately, you believe we've had way too much medicine for too many years, and the real danger is that Big Pharma is now more powerful, profitable, and prolific than any time in history. Doctor, welcome to London Real.
Thank you for having me, Brian. Great to be here.
It's great to have you here. I'm going to go straight to a tweet that I think you sent out in the last 24 hours, and I think you said that when it comes to COVID vaccines and Big Pharma, the cover-up is now worse than the crime. And I know I'm probably dropping you right in the middle of this, but I feel like once we start, it'll probably, work its way out to find your whole path to coming here. But, 5 years ago, did you ever think that you might be tweeting something just like that?
No, definitely not. And certainly not anything in relation to vaccines. Brian, I have been involved in this campaign to try and change the system that ultimately harms patients because of medical misinformation, a lot of it driven by pharmaceutical industry for quite a long time. But I never thought I'd get to a stage where I'd be attacking any vaccine, to be honest. For me, vaccines are like the holy grail in medicine. I put them in a very special place. Something that, a phrase a lot of people would associate with safe and effective. I swallowed that Kool-Aid. I still, to a large degree, do that for traditional vaccines, but certainly not this COVID vaccine, mRNA vaccine, absolutely not. And even not just that, even the AstraZeneca vaccine as well, which was effectively pulled in the summer of 2021 in most European countries because of these serious adverse effects on the cardiovascular system. So yeah, I never thought I'd be here.
It's weird because I got an engineering degree from MIT, and I think because I was surrounded by science my whole life, and I was in science fairs when I was a kid, and I was a programmer, I kind of just trusted the science as opposed to maybe the application of that science, in a legal way and in a safety way. And so coming into 2020, actually right when I interviewed Robert Kennedy in 2020, around in May, I was like, sign me up, I'm ready. I mean, vaccines have saved so many people, and it's obviously a thing. And spending 90 minutes speaking to Robert Kennedy, and he walked me through, the legislation from '86 and just all of these facts that I never thought about, I really had to think hard about something I'd kind of blindly trusted and assumed it was effective. It seems like so many people are that way about something like a vaccine.
Yeah, I think so. I mean, if you look at, and we could come on to the World Health Organization, I think there's issues with the WHO, which I think again have got worse in terms of their independence over the years. But if you look at if you go to the World Health Organization's website, they say that traditional vaccines are responsible globally for saving 4 to 5 million lives a year. And I think that probably has some validity, especially in the sort of more developing countries, Africa, India, etc. But again, I think we have blindly accepted that if it's a vaccine, it must be safe and effective. And I think we have to shift the conversation ultimately to saying, clearly this has been highlighted with COVID, all vaccines are clearly not the same. Rather than just being a black and white, I'm against vaccines, I don't, or I'm totally pro-vax. I think there's a middle ground here that we need to have a discussion on, a more nuanced discussion to get to the truth.
So you tweeted that today. If you could have the ears of 8 billion people in the world, like what would you like to say to them? Like right at this point in time, what's the most important thing to do? Is it to educate people on the dangers of this? Is it to stop all these COVID mRNA vaccines now for everybody until we know more? What do you think is the best thing to do?
Well, the current issue right now that we're facing is this, is the fact that this product has been delivered, pushed on millions, hundreds of millions of people, billions of people, if you like, around the world.
It's like
right?
5.3 billion have gotten a vaccine.
Which is very poor in its efficacy and has very common, or certainly not rare, serious side effects. And I concluded at the end of last year when I published this paper, which I spent quite a long time writing and going through a very rigorous peer review process, that it should be suspended, and probably now with what we know should never have been approved in the first place. But I think if we take a step back to try and understand the roots of this problem, Brian, I would say that the one thing that I would, want everyone to know, and this may sound very controversial, but comes from the person I call the Stephen Hawking of medicine, the most cited medical researcher in the world, John Ioannidis. If everybody just knew these few words to start with, the barista in the coffee shop, the taxi driver, the cleaner, the doctor, the nurse, if they knew from this position, they started from this position, that most medical research findings are false, if everybody knew that, then we could start to change the system for the better.
Man, that's a scary statement.
Yeah, well, that's from John Ioannidis, and a paper he published in PLOS One in 2006. That was a title. In fact, it's the most downloaded research scientific paper in the history of medicine.
Most medical research findings are false.
Yeah.
Okay. How do we unpack that? Because most people, when they go to their doctors, they look to their doctors as if they're some almost like deities to a certain extent, unerring. Sure. We trust our health to them, and we just assume that everything they conclude and write about is gospel.
Well, I think if we start from a position of, first of all, addressing this socio-cultural problem where many people believe incorrectly, including doctors, by the way, that medicine is an exact science like, say, physics or chemistry. And it's not. It never has been. It's an applied science. It's a science of human beings. It's a social science. It's constantly evolving. It's constantly changing as new information emerges. So if we start from that position, a lot of the way we make diagnosis or the way that we come to conclusions about what's at the root cause of a particular patient's presentation of symptoms or disease is it's the art of probabilities based upon information that we gather over time. So if we start from that place, then it's easier to unpack why Ioannidis would say most research published findings are false, because most of that research now is funded, analyzed, produced by drug companies who have a very specific legal obligation to produce profit for their shareholders and then not to give you the best treatment. Although we would believe, many people would believe that would be the case. And in that process, what they do invariably when they draw their conclusions, which are published in these journals like The Lancet or the New England Journal of Medicine, is that almost always they will exaggerate the safety and benefits of their products in order to sell them. So that is how that concept is best understood. And one of the other things that John Ioannidis does, and he's also a mathematical genius. I think he got the national award in Greece for mathematics, actually. That's where he trained originally, and he went to medical school there. He also says, through his mathematical modeling analysis of trying to figure out what's reliable and what's not, or what is less reliable, he says the greater the financial interests or other prejudices in a given field, the less likely the research findings are to be true. Which is very interesting because, you know, I know you, Brian, come from a kind of engineering and also a banking background, right? So if people think of technology and all the advancements that we've made in technology, which have been phenomenal in the last several hundred years, but certainly in the last few decades, we cannot apply that to medicine. You know, but people do. They think that if it's an expensive drug, it must be really effective. But actually what I do and what a lot of the people in this space are trying to do is to try and say, listen, let's first and foremost understand what is the reliability of these research findings. You know, what kind of data are we using here to make these conclusions? Ideally, we call it the hierarchy of evidence-based medicine tells us that the double-blinded randomized control trial is the highest quality level of evidence. But you actually ideally shouldn't be relying on one trial. You certainly shouldn't be relying on, you should be skeptical if it's sponsored by the drug industry, and then has it been replicated? And often the approval process doesn't allow us to get to a greater truth to understand that this information that we're getting, even from a randomized control trial, is reliable. And then is, okay, once we know there are limitations, which we should tell patients, right? That's part of actually the best way to practice medicine, is to also discuss uncertainties about anything you're telling a patient. Again, most doctors probably don't do this, we know that. So for me, I'm trying to be the best possible doctor I can be for my patients by understanding the information I'm using to the best level so that I can communicate that to patients in a way that they can understand, right? So for example, we look at statin drugs, one of the most prescribed lucrative drugs in the history of medicine, cholesterol-lowering drugs, estimated to be prescribed to up to maybe 1 billion people in the world, right? And we know that most people taking statins don't receive any benefit because the trials conducted by industry show that if you haven't had a heart attack, and these are most people who are prescribed statins, your absolute benefit of a statin at best over a 5-year period is 1 in 100 in preventing a non-fatal heart attack or non-disabling stroke. Yet most patients don't know this. Most doctors may not know it, and then they don't communicate it to patients. So we've got this biased decision-making process going on, which ultimately leads to an over-medicated population.
Right.
And really, once people understand that, everything else starts to fall into place. Or certainly they can then trace the roots of why we are where we are right now. You know, to the extent where one estimate suggests the third most common cause of death after heart disease and cancer globally is prescribed medications, what your doctor prescribes for you.
Right. You probably didn't or shouldn't have taken anyways, and it killed you. You talk about the Vioxx settlement, and that was like maybe a way to show people about how here was a drug that was created. They knew there were going to be certain side effects, but it reminds me of that line from Fight Club, right? Where Edward Norton goes to look at the wrecked car, and he said it's simple. They take how much money it's going to make versus the probability of a settlement and how much the settlement's going to cost. If one number is bigger than the other, they go with the drug. Is it that simple, and do you use that Vioxx as an example of what the pharma industry does of making money versus liability?
Yeah, absolutely. I think they see it as a cost of business. I think they go in trying to develop drugs that are going to be ideally of some benefit compared to a previous drug. But what often happens, Brian, in these trials is that harms start to come out, and we've seen historically that they have been aware that there are certain harms, you know, with these drugs that can even kill people, like such as Vioxx, which ultimately was thought to be responsible for the deaths of maybe 60,000 Americans.
More than the Vietnam War.
And hundreds of thousands of heart attacks, right?
Right. More than the Vietnam War casualties.
Well, yes,
and
exactly.
Yet most Americans probably don't even know that.
Yeah, absolutely. And Merck knew, right? Their scientists knew that this was going to cause harm, but they, as legal entities, they were there to try and utilize the system to maximize profit, to try and hide the data on the harms, sell it as a really effective drug, better than ibuprofen. And ultimately it was found that was all found to be false, and they got fined close to $1 billion. But they ended up making more profit from the sales of the drug, right? A lot more, so that they see it as a cost of business. And then nothing changes in the system to stop this happening again, and no one got fired, no one lost their job. They probably got promoted, I suspect, some of these people who are behind Vioxx. So when people understand that, and that's been going on for a very long time, then, you ask me like, what do 8 billion people in the world need to know? They need to know this stuff, right? Because most people wouldn't find this acceptable. We live in democracies, and they're only able to sustain this system because of the lack of knowledge around this sort of stuff. But what they do is they will deliberately try and suppress this information getting out. And that even means capturing media, capturing politicians, capturing regulators. And I've come up with this term, which even Richard Horton referenced in The Lancet, because he came to my talk in London when I discussed all of these issues. The drivers at the root of this, or one of the main drivers at the root of many health problems going on in society today, even the suppression of democracy in many ways, is a psychopathic entity. So I call it the psychopathic determinants or drivers of ill health. Because the way that many of these multinational corporations make money and is often behaving as legal entities in a psychopathic way. So callous unconcern for the safety of others, incapacity to experience guilt, deceiving people, deliberate lying, conning others for profit. So they tick all those boxes. So for me, I think that is something that people need to try and understand, because it also explains the cultural problems we're also facing right now.
Right.
Where we have people increasingly have less access to the truth. But also, Brian, we discussed this even before we started the show, I think the polarization of views around all of these things means that we are losing our capacity also for empathy. So for the human being, what it means to be human, this is not good, right? Losing access to the truth, being less empathetic. It's a recipe for chaos, it's a recipe for anarchy, it's a recipe for violence, verbal and physical violence. And that's my biggest concern, is that society is heading down that direction because we are ultimately being influenced by psychopathic entities. And
pharma is at the top of that list.
100%.
Because
Absolutely.
of the money involved. It's that simple.
Yeah, but if you take it further, it's the economic system that has allowed this to happen. Right. Maybe by stealth over time, they have behind the scenes. I talk about this increasing visible and invisible unchecked power. The invisible power is what they're doing behind the scenes, where they are influencing regulations. They are talking for, they use this term, which is propagandized about, we want small government, we don't want big government because they are nanny state and they're interfering with our lives. They manipulate people through this sort of terminology. That comes from the corporations, right? I'm all for personal responsibility. I'm also for freedom of choice, 100%. But to exercise personal responsibility, to make choices, you have to have knowledge, the right information, and you have to have choice. When it comes to things like, for example, obesity in the food environment, you also have to have access to healthy food, and it needs to be affordable. And if you don't have all those four, you can't exercise personal responsibility.
Yeah. So let's talk about some of the ways that pharma projects power. I'm just going to guess a few off the top of my head and tell me if I'm right or wrong, or the ones that you think about. But in America, since you can advertise on television for a lot of these drugs, they seem to, quote unquote, own a lot of the networks because they pump so much advertising dollars, it feels like they can have an influence. That's one guess.
Yeah.
Secondly, campaign funding. I'm guessing donations to politicians, whether it's quid pro quo or not, to leave us alone. Agencies, which was kind of an eye-opener during the COVID case, of whether it's the FDA or agencies here, or the CDC or the NIH or whatever that's called, where they actually end up paying for a lot of the research, the salaries, et cetera. I'm sure I'm forgetting more. Yeah, I don't know, that's where I'm starting, where they have influence. And then I guess medical schools and funding of research. And those are things that are coming to the top of my head, and I probably don't even know the half. But
yeah, no, I think you've covered most of the main ones there, actually, Brian.
Right.
So it's control of decision making, so lobbying politicians. And actually, I think, this is also an important area to discuss, because understandably, there is a lot of division right now around this whole issue about the vaccine, and there is certainly a subset of people who think there is some master plan or conspiracy to kill people, depopulation agenda, all this kind of stuff. I'm very Socratic in my thinking as well, right? When Socrates said true wisdom only comes from dialogue. So as I've had the opportunity in my career with some of the work I've done to have access and have conversations with some of these people, some of these politicians who've been involved in government roles, former secretaries for health, for example, they come to me and ask me for medical advice. They trust me. And most of the time, a lot of their decision making is because of lobbying, a combination of ignorance and the illusion of knowledge, right? So, they genuinely believe what they're doing is based upon all the information they're being given without really understanding that they're being lobbied by people who are presenting information to them as expert opinion, which is ultimately just biased information, which is propagated for the purposes of profiting these multinational corporations.
Okay.
So I think but you're right. So political environment, right? And we can see a great example of that. I'm glad you raised that point. We'll move on to the others because it's quite relevant. When I started campaigning specifically on the COVID vaccine issue, was when they started to when Sajid Javid, our Secretary for Health, got up in Parliament towards the end of 2021 and said that we're going to now mandate the vaccine for healthcare workers. And I thought there's something odd. This doesn't make sense, because at the beginning we were told the narrative was this is only going to be offered to people at high risk. In fact, I was on Good Morning Britain because I took 2 doses of the jab and went on Good Morning Britain not to kind of coerce people. I actually said I understand why people are hesitant. I understand why the rational concerns here, and it was specifically for ethnic minority groups at the time because they were more hesitant than others. But when they started bringing in the mandates, I thought, no, this doesn't make any sense. And ultimately, I spoke to somebody, we helped overturn, I was involved in the campaign to overturn the vaccine mandate for healthcare workers. So fine, that was a great victory for this movement. But ultimately, I recently met somebody, I won't name, somebody who was in that government, very senior, who said to me explicitly, Aseem, I now realize the only people to benefit from the mandates of mandating the COVID vaccines were Big Pharma. This is a former government minister who was there at the time. So, and this person also said to me, I also now have a greater appreciation now. A lot of the policies that we passed were actually was influenced by commercial interests. So it's interesting that person is now awake. So
what does that tell you? That tells you that they didn't know it at the time, right? So they thought they were acting in the best interest of the politicians, of the people, and what they could do at the time. But now they have now realized that actually this infects so much of government decision making.
I think they're slowly waking up.
Okay.
In terms of Sajid Javid as well, I'm sure he genuinely believed he was probably doing something that was the right thing. But I have no doubt that the tentacles, someone behind the scenes linked to pharma was influencing him, right? And a lot of these politicians, they have this idea that, we have to be friendly to industry. We have to support industry, right? Industry are the saviors of the economy. Industry ultimately have the solutions. And we know this is all false, ultimately. I'm sure there are great people within industry with great ideas, but the overall extra power that these industries have is actually causing damage to our democracy and our health now, whether it's big food or big pharma. And just on that point, again, in terms of conversations, several years ago, I'd been involved in this battle with sugar industry.
To continue watching the rest of the episode for free, visit our website londonreal.tv or click the link in the description below.